Welcome, everyone, to the Compassionate Care ALS Cultivating Compassion Education series. My name is James Churches, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to this special event with Ron Hoffman and Ron Gladis. Before we get started, I'd like to do just a quick centering piece, just get us all here, fully present and centered and open and ready to receive the wisdom of these two fine men. And so I'll use the singing bowl here, and we'll just let the sound take us into a place of quiet, a place of wholeness and readiness. And let's take a few deep breaths together, really filling the whole body with the life force that is all around us, and just letting it come in and hold and release. Feel your feet on the ground, feel yourself connected to the earth, and feel your head and your spine straight and tall. Feel yourself connected to the great mystery above, to the energies of the four directions: left, right, front, back. Mm. Very good, and welcome. I'd like to just say a brief word about our two guest speakers today. I think many of you know Ron Hoffman, founder of Compassionate Care ALS, began his journey down this path as a caregiver for Gordon Heald and became his full-time caregiver. Uh, Learned about ALS by living it with a man who was truly unique, and inspired by Ron's ability to be there for him, and said, keep doing this, Ron, after I'm gone. And that's how it started, and Ron's been doing that for now 26 years, caring for and guiding and being a source of calm and strength and wisdom along the way. So welcome, Ron. And also very, very nice to have Ron Gladis with us, a dear friend of Ron's, of our Ron's. Uh, he is the husband of Mariah Fenton Gladis, who Ron cared for 37 years along her journey with ALS, and her incredible inspirational way of being in the world, traveling around and speaking and living fully and just inspiring so many people with a message of hope and wisdom. And um, many of us today begin our day by looking in the mirror and telling ourselves that we love ourselves. And that's a teaching from Mariah. So, welcome, both of you. We'll start with Ron Hoffman. Thank you, Ron. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you, James. Ron, good to be with you, my friend. Absolutely. Yeah, I had the good pleasure of meeting Ron and Mariah some years back. I probably got to know Mariah several years as she was living with ALS. I'm not sure I've met anyone that has inspired me more than Mariah and Ron and how they navigated all the complexities of living with such an illness. And of course, watching and observing Ron from afar and how he tended to and cared for Mariah. You know, as I got involved with this work, the caregiving aspect, and again, whether this is ALS or any other diagnosis, to me, actually, it's all the same, though ALS can indeed be horrific There are other horrific diagnoses out there as well. But, how we show up and how we tend to and care for an individual, it's the same regardless of the diagnosis. And yet, what I realized this morning as I was thinking about this, there's nothing that really prepares us to tend to and care for a loved one. I mean, life goes on, and all of a sudden there's an ALS diagnosis, and life kind of becomes a traumatic experience, which many people aren't aware of. And yet, how do we do this? Again, what prepares us for this? How do we truly learn to live our lives in a different way? And that's what I share with my families all the time, whether it's the individual living with ALS or it's the caregiver. How do we do this? And one of the things that sparked my interest and planted the seed as we were living with ALS, Gordon, his wife Betsy, and I, as we were looking at the information we were receiving from the two organizations at the time, which was the ALS Association and Muscular Dystrophy Association. Respectfully, we would look at it, read it, and seem completely irrelevant to the circumstance we were in. So a seed was planted in my mind. There needs to be a different way of doing this. Now, at the time, I certainly wasn't prepared or had the realization of what that meant. But again, about a month before Gordon passed, I sat with him and Betsy, and do you want to create a fund in your name? And fortunately, they said yes. And of course, I said, well, before you say yes, what do you want to do? Do you want to support research, or do you want to help individuals? Thank goodness they said, let's help families. I said, thank you. Because again, in our experience, something was truly, truly missing. And as time went on, as I created the Gordon T. Healed ALS Fund, and several years later, it birthed Compassionate Care ALS. We just outgrew the fund. And even then, it's like, what am I doing? Where do I go to school for this? I mean, there's a great deal of pushback. People wanted to know what my credentials were. And of course, my credentials were my life experiences. And then I started meeting some extraordinary people in the world who became my teachers, my mentors, my colleagues, my dear friends. And they actually helped me just remember what I already knew, which everyone on this call actually already knows. It's in our DNA, it's in our bones. And that is how to tend to and care for an individual. But I think one of the challenges, one, how do we get out of our own way? How do we, actually navigate through our own woundedness? Because I think our own woundedness kind of gets in the way of that. And not just for the individual living with ALS, but the person tending to and caring for the significant other. All these things start percolating. And are we willing to do that work necessary for ourselves and for our loved one to truly help navigate all the complexities? And there's so many. I do want to read something, and then I'm going to turn over to Ron. This is a poem written by Henry Nguyen. I believe I'm pronouncing his last name, Nouwen. It's from his book, Reaching Out. Healing. Healing means, first of all, the creation of an empty but friendly space where those who suffer can tell their story to someone who can listen with real attention. We have to receive the story of our fellow human beings with a compassionate heart, a heart that does not judge or condemn, but recognizes how the stranger's story connects with our own. We have to offer safe boundaries within which the often painful past can be revealed and the search for a new life can find a start. Our most important question is not what to say or what to do, but how to develop enough inner space where the story can be received. Healing is the humble but also very demanding task of creating and offering a friendly, empty space where strangers can reflect on their pain and suffering without fear and find the confidence that makes them look for new ways right in the center of their confusion. Those new ways, for me, are how do I learn to live my life in a different way? Because even as the individual living with ALS, is going through their own healing, whether they know it or not, or the healing that is the potentiality that exists for them. But as the caregiver, we too can go through our own healing. Again, I'm reminded of how Mariah, in her own beautiful ways, navigated all these complexities. She found her path along with Ron. And honestly, that's an example I hold up, and I've been blessed to meet other individuals who found their own way through in regards to how to live with their dying. How to live with their dying. Ron?
There you go. Well, first of all, I really want to say thank you, Ron, for what you do here. I know that there may be people on the call here who are not familiar with your work, and I certainly don't want to go into discussing it all, but with 37 years of living with ALS, I've certainly seen you to be very unique in the work that you do, especially given around the compassionate care that you offer here. So it's really unique work. And I know you don't want the kudos, you don't care about the kudos, but I just want to let people know who don't know you as the work that you do. So thank you. There probably are people on the call that don't know about myself and Mariah, and certainly I think there are people on here, I know there are, that do know, but I'm going to very briefly give you a little bit of background. I met Mariah when I was 37 years old, 36, 37, I forget exactly, and fell in love, and we were going forward. We didn't know where we were going, but we were going forward. And one day she told me about she was having some experiences with her right hand, in that was wrapping around a racket, the racket of a racquetball racket, if you know, I said that. And that concerned her, and it kept on happening. So she would have to peel her fingers back off of the racket at times, and that got to be painful. So we decided that we would look into this and see what was going on. And we ended up, after several doctors really didn't understand it, we ended up with going to a neurologist who happened to be a friend of hers, who was the head of the department and at Penn. And she had a series of tests that happened, and finally they came into her. They gave her a room, and she was in the room there. I wasn't allowed in the room, by the way, when they came in to give their diagnosis, because we weren't married at that time, which always is strange to me, but that's what the rules are. But when they left the room, the door was slightly open, and I heard her crying, and I certainly jumped up and went into the room. And she told me she had been diagnosed with ALS, and she didn't know what that was, and that they gave her basically a 10% chance of living 2 years. In fact, so she was dying. So that was really a harsh diagnosis to receive. And I, for some reason, said, "Okay, Mariah, we're gonna do something. We're gonna make this work. So get your clothes. Let's get out of this hotel room. We're going home. We're gonna get a life together." And so that evening, I asked her to marry me. So basically, she got a death sentence and a marriage proposal in the same day. And we went on, and all of a sudden, we found that we got married 3 months later. She was still doing fine. There was no movement in the ALS that we saw. And we make a long story very short, we ended up having our first child. She got pregnant, had a child 9 months later, Luke, and still was feeling fairly good. And we had a second child, Cole. And so after that, she decided that she was feeling, her body was feeling the results of ALS, and she didn't really want to go forward with any more children. I said, fine, that was perfectly fine. So we just then continued on, and luckily for me, or luckily for Mariah as well, apparently the type of ALS that we had was very slow moving. And so 2000, she was diagnosed in 1981, and in 2018, she passed away. And I will tell you that when we went into the hospital 3 weeks before she passed away, that day that we went into the hospital, she had a full load of clients that she was still seeing. So she's a rather extraordinary woman, and we can talk about that later on. But I wanted to give you some little background for those of you who don't know Mariah or didn't know our background as to what some of the wisdom we arrived at over that course of time. So thank you for being here. I'm open to talking about anything about Mariah, myself, and caregiving, and Ron Hoffman, and the work that we're all doing, if we will. And in fact, I have to tell you this. I'll be honest with you. I told Ron Hoffman, I met you, Ron, through some other direction out at Esalen where Mariah was teaching. And I said, Ron, I said, listen, after 37 years, I don't really care to do a lot more work in the ALS arena because I've had it. I've done my job for that amount of time. But then I told him, but the work that you're doing here, I want to support you as much as I can. And however you can use me, whatever support I can give you, because I just love Ron. He's a really good friend. And I just love the compassionate care ALS. So I'm open to any questions or however you guys want to handle this. James, maybe, if you have any questions, or if anyone in the audience has any questions.
Yeah, we'll get to the questions in a bit, Ron.
Okay.
You know, the role of being a caregiver, again, as I said, what really prepares us for this. We all have incredible life experiences. You know, for me, when I was a child, I was in the hospital. Crazy circumstance. You know, simply put, my father tried to murder my mother. I got in the way, so she was shot, I was shot. That's a story unto itself, but I was on the gurney going into the hospital, and there was an orderly that came up to me, met at the ambulance, put his hand on his heart and said, Ronnie, I heard about you on the two-way. I'm here. Everything's okay. But that's something that has stayed with me my entire life. Here is a stranger with his hand on my heart. That, though I didn't have a understanding at the time, but I look on that often, if not daily, that there's someone there showing up for me. So, I mean, we've called this gathering here the art of caring. Well, this is the art of showing up, the art of being present. So there is indeed a true art, but we're also human beings. And caring for someone with ALS or, you know, other extreme circumstances, it's so not easy. Not at all. And for those of you who are, you know, tending to and caring for loved ones or friends now, there's no way I can know what your experience is, yet there are indeed commonalities, just like someone with ALS. Nobody knows how an individual with ALS feels, not even another person with ALS. We're different human beings. We have different belief systems. We have different ways of looking at the world. And so I think the challenge is sometimes, how do we get out of our own way? Because sometimes it is difficult. You know, there were times I was ready to walk out of the room because Gordon, especially when the physical ramifications of ALS really started to unfold, his ability to use his hands, his arms, because honestly, ALS took Gordon to one of the most, if not the most extreme circumstance I've witnessed in all the years I've been doing this to this day. How's that for a teacher? And respectfully and with love, Gordon used to, you know, he was the puppet master and I was the puppet. He had me up and down all the time. And I had no training for this, you know, like many of us, I just learned as I went. And there were times, literally, I would scream at him and walk out the door. You know, I smoked then, so it felt like have one drag off a cigarette and the cigarette was gone. Then as time went on, I learned to go back in, look at him, say, I'm sorry, I love you, let's move on. That's being human, because all of us who have been and who are doing this work now, there's nothing easy about it. It's really, really hard. You know, there have been circumstances where I've known spouses who've left their loved ones because they couldn't do it anymore. Everyone doesn't have the capacity to do this work. How do we learn not to judge that? You know, I certainly have. But I've seen incredible judgment when someone learns that a wife has left their husband, or a husband has left his wife. You know, I've certainly learned to actually honor that, because it couldn't be done. You know, everyone diagnosed with ALS, and sometimes I've heard this, like, you, only the good people get ALS. Well, I don't know that to be true. I know some people who've been diagnosed that, you know, they were kind of stuck and stubborn and a bit ornery before, and they've lived that way through. At the same time, I've met other individuals who the diagnosis, the experience of living with ALS has truly transformed their lives. Truly. You know, they've awakened. It's an extraordinary thing to see and to witness, which doesn't mean they still don't have those moments of, I can't do this anymore, or create more chaos for their loved one. How does a caregiver? You know what? I'm going to share that story in a minute. But Ron, a question I have for you, because you did this for 37 years. My assumption and my knowing is it wasn't always easy. How did you guys how did you as a caregiver navigate this for 37 years?
Well, in my case, I have to tell you that it was made easier because it was a very slow progression of ALS, and so over time, if Mariah would ask me to, because her fingers weren't working, to button a button on her shirt, that was easy. And then maybe a month later, she would ask me to button 2 buttons. And so within a year, I was maybe putting on her shirt. And that's the way the progression was for me. Until finally, sometime me personally, I wasn't aware of what all that I was doing, because it just happened so slowly. To be honest with you, if Mariah had been in an auto accident and ended up to be a quadriplegic overnight, I don't really know how I would handle that. But that's another situation. So it's somewhat hard, certainly. And for me personally, over many years, it just became our natural way of living. You know, I'll tell you a quick story. Mariah used to certainly drink from a straw over time. And so she used to drink wine from a straw, if you can imagine that. So we'd go to a wedding, and so I'd give her a glass of wine and put a straw in it, and that was fine. Well, one wedding I went to, and I asked Mariah, we were at a table with other people, and I asked Mariah if she wanted wine. She said no. But I asked anyone at the table, and some woman said, yeah, I'll have a glass of wine. So I went up and I got some wine for her, and I brought the wine back and at the table. I put it down in front of her, and she stared at the glass and stared at me, and I stared at the glass and stared at her, and I had put a straw in her wine glass. So it just became a very natural thing to do in my life. But I will say that, to your point, Ron, early on, Mariah began saying that ALS made her a better person. And I wasn't real happy with that, because I was still very angry at ALS. But over time, I think I began to understand, not only did it make her a better person, but it made me a better person. Because Mariah began looking at ALS as to, when she finally got over the fear of it, and the whole thing about dying was acting like a millstone around her neck, about both of our necks. No one wants to hear that. We actually went to we met someone, we were introduced to someone who had ALS for 7 years. Now, when you're diagnosed and given 2 years to live, 7 years is a big time. So we had lunch with this guy, and he was a dentist who quit his practice, went off to live in some cave in Colorado somewhere because he was diagnosed with ALS, and then decided that he was fine and came back and opened up his dentistry practice. But you have to understand, 7 years was a lot for us. And so somewhere, further down the line, there were some ALS patients I knew, a woman in particular, who used to invite us to her home, along with newly diagnosed ALS patients, just so they could meet Mariah, just so they could see someone who maybe had 15 years worth of ALS under her belt, because of what that meant, the kind of hope that they got from that. So I not only got to understand Mariah feeling what she took out of ALS, the positives that she took, and not the negatives. She could carry both. She could carry the fact that she was going to die, and she could carry the fact that she wanted to live, that she was going to do everything she could to live, but that she might die. And so through all of that, in time, I think I got to understand that it made me a better person. To be able to work with Mariah and to live with her and to love her and, do what we needed to do to go forward. So how did I do it? I did it because of Mariah. I did it because we both wanted to make a life. We both came from somewhat dysfunctional families in terms of parenting, and we had said that we're not going to let, it's not an option for us to get a divorce at any time. And certainly this wasn't going to do it, but it made us a better person. She was able to live with ALS, looked at it as the president of the local Philadelphia ALS Association said, Mariah looked at ALS as more of an inconvenience. And I found that kind of astounding. And we were lucky. Those of you who have been, connected to ALS one way or the other know what a devastating disease is. It's terrible. I've seen friends of mine go down in 6 months, and that was very hard to see. And we've been very lucky with living as long as we did. On the other hand, I think if we can look at ALS as something that could kill us, certainly, but at the same time, there are some lessons to be learned here, and might allow us to live daily very fully, which is what Mariah did. I think that's what allowed us to go forward. And that was going forward, that was very important for us.
Going forward. I've gotten this last week a handful of emails with the same theme. And the emails go something like this. Comes from a son or a daughter that don't live at home. Mom or dad are the primary caregiver, and their loved one, their spouse, who has ALS. Things are moving along. The care piece is really, really difficult. And the only person that he will allow to take care of her is his wife. The only person she will allow to take care of her is her husband. Metaphorically, when I see circumstances like that, the caregiver metaphorically is beaten, battered, and bruised, because they've been doing this for a while. And forget the emotional piece, which we could talk about on and on. But when you bring the physicality into it, when things become all physical, and when there's only one person doing literally the heavy lifting, it gets really, really hard. And so the son and or the daughter is reaching out to me. What do we do? How do we? They're lost as to how to go forward. So I shared with him, I'm happy to go see your mom and dad. Well, don't tell him that I said, you don't need to worry about that. All righty. Because we are able to go into a circumstance and assess what's going on. And it's all through questions. You know, how is your care? Do you have care coming from, what does your care circumstance look like? Well, my husband does it all. And I'll look at the husband and go, wow, okay. Right. And then my question will be, well, what if something happens to your husband? If he hurts his back? Right? It's just literally helping people navigate these extreme circumstances. Everyone can't afford private care. Insurance certainly doesn't cover it. So, and these are a few of the circumstances that come up that unless we're willing to communicate with each other, this is where chaos often will reign. This is what makes it so incredibly difficult. You know, we've worked with folks who have the resources and still don't want to pay those resources in order to get additional help in there. You know, oftentimes there's people in the community. There's many different ways of finding and accessing help. But most importantly, the ability to communicate with each other, to remind my loved one, I love you so much, but I cannot do this myself anymore. In all the years I've been doing this, I've never met anybody that can do this themselves. Which doesn't mean I haven't seen people who've done it themselves. And after meeting them and spending time with them early on and seeing them a year or two down the road, not recognizing who they were as a human being, that's how hard it was. So the ability to communicate and to truly be honest, not just with our loved one, but with ourselves, that I need help doing this. And sometimes it can be hard to find that help. There's so many possibilities in what living with something like ALS can look like. It touches every aspect of our humanity, every aspect of our psyche. And, you know, we have people in our community, I'm guessing all of you have experienced this, they think they know what's going on. Respectfully, they have no idea what's going on. You know, if individuals are fortunate to have the monetary resources where they can get help, that's wonderful. But I know people with monetary resources that wife or husband still has to do everything. It's like, wow. Which certainly isn't always the case, but these are the challenges that we have as, you know, you have as individuals living with something like
Yeah, Ron, if I can follow that up. Did you freeze, by the way? I'm not sure if you're frozen.
Looks like he did. So,
but I'll follow that up anyway. I could do it all. That was my feeling. I could do it all. I don't need your help. I don't need anybody's help. I'm going to do it. And I think that may be an attitude that many people have. And it was Mariah who began showing me that that I, you know, I couldn't do it all. And that there were a lot of positives to not doing it all. So, for example, we went to the movies one night, and over the course of the movies, it had snowed and really snowed big time. So that when she was in a wheelchair. So when we wheeled out, I pushed her. It wasn't electric. The car was in the parking lot of the movie theater, and I'm saying to myself, how do I get out of here? How do I get her over there? And I didn't want to leave her alone. So someone who was also coming out at the same time looked at me and sort of saw my dilemma and said, hey, can I help? And I said, yes, sure. And so with he and some other people got together, we all got Mariah over to the car, got her in the car, laughing and having a good old time. And it created memory for me. And I haven't forgotten that moment. So I think that allowing people in really is a good thing for all of us, allowing people to help. I have some crazy ideas on all of that. I believe there should be no red lights anywhere in the city. So, for example, because I found that when the red lights go out and for some electrical problem, people then, when you come up to an intersection, you wave each other through. And so there's a contact that happens there that normally would not happen. So there's a human contact that happens. It's a crazy idea, I know, but the thing about allowing other people to do that is also allowing me to understand my capabilities. And Ron asked the question earlier about how I got through all of this. And one of the things that allowed me to get through this was recognizing what I would call my polarities. Being aware of myself, knowing that there's some things I could do, there's some things I can't do. Knowing that some days I'm a good guy and some days I'm not so good a guy. And, I'm a pain in the ass or I'm really a nice guy. And knowing that about myself is really, really important, because in this whole ALS situation, I need to be able to forgive myself, because there are days when I didn't want to do what I needed to do. I always looked at Mariah as precious cargo. So in the middle of the night, we got up and I walked her to the bathroom because she was unsteady. The thought that went through my mind was precious cargo. I've got something precious. But there were days when I wasn't there. I just either I was exhausted, I just didn't feel it. I don't know what it was, but I didn't want to do it. I did it, but I just didn't want to. I wasn't. Hey, I'm a really happy guy doing all this work. It's tough. Being a caregiver, as Ron says, really tough work. And so I needed to have some compassion for myself, basically, is what it was. That was really important. I certainly had compassion for Mariah, but I had to have it for myself in order to go forward. So that became very important for me to understand that. And so I've decided to write a book about this, and I've actually started some pieces of it, but it's called Love, Loyalty, and the Right Thing to Do. The love part of it's easy. So I would work with Mariah and help care for her because I love her. I really do. And then there are some days when, I'm not really so much in love with Mariah today, because maybe we had an argument or we had a difference of opinion or whatever it was, or I wasn't feeling all that well. And so, I would do what I did out of loyalty, because this woman was so helpful to me in my life. She bore 2 children in my life. I have 2 wonderful sons because of her, and all of the things that she gave me. So I did it out of loyalty. And then there's a third thing that I never really got to, but it's the right thing to do. So when she needed help, it's really the right thing to do to help her. And I never got to that stage, by the way, but that was my way back up position, in case I didn't particularly feel loyal for some reason in that particular day. So Ron asked the question, how did I get by? I got by with knowing myself, my limitations. I got by with having compassion for myself when I wasn't up to the task, when I just wasn't there in my mind. And I was, had mercy on myself, basically, to go forward. And then the next day, of course, things would change. So welcome back, Ron.
Thank you. I lost power over where I was, so I had to come to another
Yikes.
We have a beautiful center here.
You never lose power, my friend. I got to tell you.
The buildings lose power, so it's really windy. So I went from my place over to the main building here at our center. So,
anyway, I was just following up what you said about how difficult it is to to continually give care, to give yourself up in life. I mean, to give up all your needs. You know, and the other thing is you have to be able to say that you have needs in this. I never liked to say that I needed anything. So, but I learned to say that through Mariah and through this experience of doing that. Yeah. And in fact, I had a discussion with someone I know closely, and they were adamant that I shouldn't have needs. That it's not strong to have needs. You need to be strong. It's weak to have needs. That's a discussion I actually had, and so I had to have that discussion and said, "Hey, I'm a rock. I could be a rock. Anytime you need me to be a rock, I'll do that. But I also I have needs. I need someone to say, hey, good job. I need a pat on the back. I need someone to say hello. I need someone to care, or someone to love, So all of those things, I do need that. And so for me to recognize that I'm not a rock and I don't have to be a rock all the time was important for me to go forward in our relationship and be able to be, successful, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, it reminds me, I often sit with folks, and it's truly assessing what the circumstances are, really honing one's own intuition into just sensing, because we go in and we see families we've never met before. We've talked briefly on the phone, we've done intake. But, oftentimes I remind the caregivers, those doing the tending, look, our work is here equally for you. You are equally as important as to your loved one here. And sometimes, quite frankly, we work more with the carers than the individual living with ALS. Mm-hmm. I will often share to the person living with ALS, this isn't just about you. This isn't just about you. This is about your husband, your wife here as well. They are equally as important. And, I've just seen too many folks doing their very best to show up for their loved one. And again, just beaten, battered, and bruised, metaphorically speaking. And sometimes, quite frankly, every once in a while, what we will see, and it breaks my heart, is where people are actually emotionally abused. Physical abuse is one thing. Emotional abuse can be just as difficult. And sometimes we see that. So what do we do as carers, as those tending to our loved ones, to really take care of ourselves as well? Because we can't do this alone. Maybe it's finding friends or extended family members to sit with. But what's important, and when we're sitting with someone, I'm not a huge fan of the word advice. My definition of advice is me telling you what I think you should do. I never do that. But what I will give and what I will offer is counsel. This is what's possible. And I remind each of you on here who are caring for a loved one, you are so incredibly important. Equally as important as the one you're tending to. Respectfully, sometimes I didn't know how to get out of my own way. Right? Again, when we're seeking that, again, my word is counsel, others want to give advice, it's really important. I share with folks, if someone comes in giving advice, telling you what they think you should be doing, one, you have my permission to say, please don't, stop. Because again, no one in the outside world, as much as they might think, know what's going on with you and your loved one, they don't. Even another person living with ALS, as I said before, we're different human beings. We have different belief systems, a different psyche, different ways of looking at the world. So, respect to everyone, but at the same time, they're not in your circumstance. How do we find ourselves in a place where we can have more patience? How can we learn to say, honey, I can't do this right now? How do we learn to say no? No. And it's okay to say no sometimes. I think for some care folks, and what it took me a long time to learn is I am actually equally as important in this dynamic as Gordon was. You know, and I think sometimes that gets lost. How do we learn to be okay with what is and yet find ourselves and find the way to navigate all these complexities? Because it is indeed complex. Sometimes I know, especially if we're sitting with someone as things are going on, sometimes less is more. You know, sometimes being in a place of not knowing is okay. We don't have to have all the answers because sometimes there are no answers to have. Sometimes it's okay just to sit, hold hands, or lay your hands on top of your loved one's hands and just feel the energetic exchange, to feel the love. You know, it's important, I think, that we can get to that place. I mean, there were times when, and you know what, I didn't honestly have enough time with Mariah, and I love this woman. Again, absolutely extraordinary human being, none more so that I've met. But I know the times that I did get to spend, and I just throw this up as an example with Ron and Mariah, you know, to be able to see the love. And also know beyond the love, there's also, sometimes it's hard. It's really hard. And to be able to remember to share with our loved one the appreciation that we have for them. It's important. And like Ron said, you know, because sometimes there's so much that we do for families. I mean, we bring all sorts of resources to bear, more than you can possibly imagine, the things that we often do, because everything's not on our website. I'm not a big believer in that. And I mean, just as an example, you know, whatever it was we did, and one of my staff told me they'd called or something like that. And my question was, did they say thank you? Because I know how hard my team works. And they're out there tending to and caring for individuals. And we have over 870 some families we work with. And sometimes it's important for that acknowledgement. And yet sometimes our loved ones or our significant others are so caught up in the extraordinary circumstances of having to live with this thing called ALS, the uninvited guest, or we're so caught up in caring, we forget to acknowledge to one another the beauty, one that we've lived, and the beauty that exists right now, and the beauty that's in front of us with all this chaos. So I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that. Because I do know the one way, in my experience, that many people are able to get through it is with love. And I think that's what Mariah and Ron, I mean, I share Mariah's story all the time because that's what's possible. You know, I don't know many people that live 37 years, but damn it, it's possible. And just how significant it is and how some people are able to navigate it, because oftentimes we can be incredibly lost. We can't see what's going to happen tomorrow. Yeah, it's important to be in the moment and today, but to acknowledge that we're in this together, those of you who are with family or significant others, and to acknowledge that, to acknowledge how hard it is, to be able to acknowledge just not how hard it is, but the opportunity to make good with everything we need to make good with, you know, for that self-exploration. You know, in the First Nation world, there's something called Decision Road, Purpose Circle, and Death Lodge. Whereas Decision Road, we're always walking with the knowledge that one day we will die, right? And in the Purpose Circle, it's kind of like a life review. Stories are so important. So if we can share stories along the way with our loved one in a good way, you know, I mean, it really, really helps for all of us to engage. And then, the death lodge is to make good, to say our thank yous, to say I'm sorry's. There's many, many ways that we can navigate this journey. I moved up here into Massachusetts in spring of '88. I didn't go to school for this. This experience found me. And I'd done many, many things in my life, right? Career-wise. And I was a theater major for 3 months in school. I was an optician. I was a hairdresser. I was a massage therapist. I grew up in retail. I was an optician. And I moved up here to open up a clothing store in the spring of '88. Well, within 9 months, I lost my mother, my uncle who was handicapped, and my grandfather. Cancer this and cancer that. Now, I was their caregiver, not that it was hands-on, but I was literally there with each of them. And it was one right after the other. One of the more profound experiences was sitting with my uncle who had had the IQ of a child. He lived with my grandmother his whole life, but he went to the hospital in August of '88. He never came home. But literally every day, every night, I was just sat there with him in silence, but just being with him, maybe laying my hand on his hand or just by his side. So there's so many ways that this can work for us. What's important is to remember none of us are alone. We don't have to do this alone. Hopefully you each have someone that you can reach out to that can just listen to you. All righty? A family member, a friend. If you're part of our organization, to us. If you're part of the Mariah Fenton Gladis Foundation, someone there. Because often we just need to be seen. We just need to be heard. Because as a caregiver tending to someone with ALS or a like type diagnosis, it's incredibly hard. And it's okay to admit this is hard. It's incredibly hard. It's emotionally difficult. It's physically beyond difficult sometimes, especially if you don't have a system in place and have assistance. Yeah. Ron, can you talk about the care that you guys had along the way, the help?
Yes. Yeah. Before I do that, though, something struck me when you were talking, and that is one of the things that Mariah used to teach, and I think is very important here, is the art of receiving. Mm-hmm. Many people can come up to you and say nice things, but if you don't take that in, if you don't absorb it, it's like, hey, Ron, you baked a nice cake the other day. You could say, well, yeah, well, it was the recipe, or whatever. So, but if you're not taking my words in, and so it was important for me when people would say stuff like that, because as I said earlier, I could do anything. I don't need you. I'll take care of it all. I'll take care of it all. So I learned over time that I couldn't. And I also learned from Mariah, by the way, that when the opportunity was there for me to receive, I did that, and actually took a moment to bring it in. Good job, I would say to myself. Talking to myself was very important. Again, it was one of the things that Mariah was teaching, but being good to yourself was very important. I think James alluded to this up front about Mariah conceptually of arriving already loved, which was important from a caregiving standpoint. When I say arriving already loved, it's a concept of loving ourselves. But more than loving ourselves, it's having a relationship with ourselves. So that was important to her. In fact, she did a TED talk around it. And it was important for me to love myself again, so that I can forgive myself if I wasn't there, if I wasn't very present, or that I didn't give her what I wanted to give her. Even now, I have regrets, of course. When someone dies, you always have, I think you have some regrets as to what you should have done or didn't do, and wish you had done better. Some small things, for example, I mean, she always had dogs in her life. And toward the end of our life together, she wanted a dog because our dog had passed away. And I kept on telling her, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I mean, I just can't take care of you and take care of a dog, believe it or not. And I said, and now I wish I had, of course, done that. All of the things that people would say to me, well, yeah, I just took my dog over to the vet the other day and he did this or that, whatever. I don't have time to take a talk to a vet. And so I rejected that and really wish now that I had done that. So I need to sort of forgive myself for that. And doing the way to do that is that internal relationship I have, that I care for myself, that I did this during our relationship. How important I knew that in order for her to be in good shape, I needed to be in good shape. I was the caregiver, basically. Now, did I have other people involved? Yes, I did. So we had aides during the day and sometimes in the evenings, and then occasionally on weekends. And so that was very, very helpful for me because honestly, I have no idea if I'd be able to do that whole thing. In 2018, she was in the hospital in February for 3 weeks as well. And at that time, we had lost a couple aides for one reason or the other, and then our major aide also got very sick, and so I didn't have her. So for the last ballpark 5 months of our existence together, I was 24/7, and that almost 24/7. We had people jump in once in a while, and that was crazy. That was absolutely crazy. But without me having that relationship with myself, acknowledging who I was, receiving from people when they said, "Hey, good job." I don't know that I would have gotten through it. I really don't. It was that much work. So yes, we had aides, and I think anyone who doesn't have the facility to, I mean, I think the Department of Aging, there are a whole bunch of facilities that you, Ron, I'm sure know a ton about in your organization. You need to have help. You definitely need to have help. So I was lucky to have some people there for many, many years. Many years when she began needing that kind of help, which was I think she was diagnosed in 81. I'm saying the first AIDS that we began bringing in was probably in the 1990s. That's when she began needing a wheelchair partially. So so we've had AIDS for a long, long time.
Thank you, Ron. Both of you, I'd like to just have one thing I'd like to ask Ron Hoffman, and then maybe we can open it up to the group for questions and discussion. But Ron, I'm remembering something from your book where you know, and having met Sean Lucy and his practice of finding moments of joy and learning how to embrace them and expand and stretch them out. And I'm wondering if you could say something about how do we as caregivers learn how to be sensitive and perceptive to those times of joy that show up and to make the most of them and really bring them to the person we're caring for and ourselves and try to cultivate that kind of a practice.
Well, there's a dual piece to that, I think. So my friend Sean, his mantra, which is really beautiful.
Did we lose Ron again?
I think the power might have went out in the other building now.
I'm back.
Well, listen, I'm going to jump in here then and talk about the fact that I think one of the things that helped me was the sense of humor. And Mariah got that as well. I have so many different situations. So I'll tell you a couple of really quick stories that we were walking out of a dinner one night, and people were walking in up these steps, and Mariah, I was walking Mariah down these steps very carefully, and we weren't stumbling, of course, but obviously she needed some help. And on the way out the door, when we were going out and they were coming in, I said to Mariah, out loud, I said, Mariah, I said, I told you not to have that last drink. So it was a little sense of humor that we had between us that got us by. So I'll tell you another quick story, which I love to tell. So a friend of ours asked us if we were in Ireland, we were going there, and asked if we would stop into a town called Knock, Ireland. And in Knock, there was a vision of the Virgin Mary. So we went to see her parents, and then went to the church. We saw a church there. And they had all these little tchotchke things outside along the street that were selling little Virgin Mary pins and statues, whatever. So we got inside, and when we walked in, the priest said that they're going to do a mass for the healing, but not. And so at some point, not everyone was to come up, but only those who needed the healing. So we stayed for the mass, and we were in the back of the church because she was in a wheelchair, and I didn't want to. But she actually could walk, kind of, but we took the wheelchair anyway because she was going to get tired. So he says, okay, those who need healing, please come up to the altar. So I rolled her up to the altar, and they did a really nice job. They did laying on of hands, and they put some ointment on her, and it was really a nice job. So I went back, I brought her back to the back of the church. Now the mass was over, and we were one of the first to come out. So we came out of the church, and we're about 20, 30 feet outside the church, and people are streaming out. And I said to Mariah, Mariah, stand up. And she said, why? I said, walk a couple steps toward me. She said, no, I'm not going to do it. I said, yeah. I said, they'll put a monument to you right here in front of this church of Knock. So, but she wouldn't do it. She didn't. That's my crazy sense of humor. So I said, have a monument. So
thank you for those stories, and I think humor is very much a big piece of the whole picture. Just before we go too much further, I wanted to get back to Ron Hoffman. You were about to tell us a mantra, and you got cut off. So
so laughter is incredibly important, as with Sean, to smile, to find those positive things in life, right? Whether it's through traveling or reading or just engaging with friends, to find joy. It really, really matters. But yeah, Sean's mantra was to elongate the joyful moments. I choose to elongate those joyful moments. He seriously and would really sit with it. Now, Sean would meditate. That was his practice. That's what allowed him to navigate the tumultuous circumstances he found himself in, because his home life was incredibly difficult. This goes back long, long ago. But how do we tend to and care for ourselves? How do we remind ourselves, I need some additional support in order to navigate this? And at the same time, what I do want to say is, how do we co-create this together? How does a couple, because you're both in it, whether it's a husband and wife, or brother or sister, the caregiver, the individual living with ALS or whatever the illness is, there's a co-caring component in there, I think. In the best circumstances, I think of my friend Doug Oakley, who was on my board. And I marveled at how he actually, living with ALS, would tend to his wife, make sure she was tended to and cared for, make sure that she didn't have to do it all. And they had the capacity to figure out what all this is going to look like for themselves. Doug would hang out with his friends. He would have his time away in order to give his wife, Patty, time away with her friends. none of us can do this alone. So whether it's just sitting outside by yourself or taking a walk in your wheelchair, or if you're able to walk, or if you're a caregiver, getting away, whether it's listening to music or reading or being in a place of prayer, whatever you wish for it to be, it's important to for yourselves to remind yourselves of the importance of who you are as an individual. And when we can do that, and it's kind of like the same thing Ron was speaking to, then we can also come together with our loved one or the person that we're caring for. And we can see the beauty in all of this chaos, if you will, because there is beauty in this. What's happening for me, and what I'm reminded of daily when I go into homes and I see families in all these circumstances, is the sacredness of the experience that they are all in, that you are all in. Regardless of how hard it is, there is, if we can find it, that sacred peace. And when we can find that, I think we in some way connect to source, whatever source is for us. God, Jesus, Buddha, our religion, whatever that might be. Because all of you, whether you're living with ALS or you're a caregiver, or, and if you're not a caregiver now, all of us will be a caregiver one day. Someone in our life will be in a circumstance we're going to have to care for. None of us can get away from that. And we can choose to show up for it, or we can choose not to show up for it. And, for some people, there's circumstances that don't allow them to show up for it. I've learned not to judge it. Everyone has a story. And oftentimes there's extraordinarily beautiful stories out there. And we're part of creating our own story, because we're all on a path. Why does this person get ALS and this other person doesn't? Forget the familiar piece, but look at the sporadic. Why me? Some people say, well, why not me? And yet, how do we make the best of it? It's just part of our life's journey. We all have a life journey, whatever that is. So elongate those joyful moments if we can. And sometimes that can be hard, because sometimes this stuff is just really hard, and sometimes it can be ugly. But I truly believe in what I've seen and what I've witnessed. There can be joy and beauty in all the chaos and ugliness and the suffering. And so how can we get beyond that and just continue to do what we do?
Ron,
Yeah.
You brought up something for me. You triggered something that when you brought up, even if you can't be a caregiver, you can't go there. I read the Viktor Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's about, he was in a concentration camp, and the people who survived the concentration camp had sort of a vision that they could do that, and they allowed themselves to look at it differently as to what their environment was. Now, all of that is extraordinarily positive, and that's what I think helped get Mariah and I through. But I also want to bring up the fact that one of the things I thought was missing from the book was those people who could not do it, who could not survive, who could not, in that particular environment of the Holocaust, have those visions, that it was much too much for them. And there's where I think that I need to have the compassion and the non-judgment for them. That's one of the things that I've learned, that even in this work, which I don't know if I can compare it to Holocaust, of course, but in this work, if for someone who just can't handle it, I understand that. It's such a horrific disease, and to try to have it, plus take care of it, plus know that your loved one has it, or maybe your child has it, for that's the worst, of course. To give some compassion there, for that, not being able to handle this. So that's what I think was missing from his book. I didn't feel that he gave enough mention of those people who couldn't, and not exactly kudos to them, but understanding that that they couldn't do it. And I get it. I really get it. So I wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron.
To me, it's about not sitting in judgment of anyone for
Right.
any choice or decision they make. How do we learn to honor each and every one of you? How do we learn to honor you in your ways? Because it's about honoring that. We all come from different places. We all don't have the capacity to navigate this like the next person. So not to sit in judgment, because again, we see so much, my staff, myself, and it's, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. So I truly honor all of you and what you do. And the fact that you're here and how you show up for your loved one or for your friends. Yeah, there's nothing easy about this, but what I do know amidst, as I said before, and this can be hard for some maybe to grasp, but there is beauty around all of this. And it's just the journey that each of you happen to be on. It's a life journey. And I was just thinking real quickly, the mythology of it all of you are on this mythic highway, creating your own mythology, right? And I mean, we sometimes speak of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. So all of you are on your own hero's journey. And, my hope and prayer for each of you is that you're able to navigate it with as much dignity and grace as you can amidst all the chaos and craziness. It's how do we learn to be in the reality of the circumstance and yet live our lives as good as we can? So it's challenging for sure.
Yeah, I have one other thing to say. Ron, you and I have had these conversations around, Mariah and I had this philosophy of sacred denial.
Huh.
And part of sacred denial was to say, certain things we're going to deny. I mean, when she was diagnosed with ALS, we sort of denied it. We had 2 children. That's crazy. There are other things that we did that were equally as crazy. And we went forward in this whole sacred denial thing. And I think that was so important for us in terms of moving forward in our lives with this horrific disease, to not deny that it existed totally, but to not let it get in our way to go forward. Now, you, Ron, have been talking with a lot of ALS patients about having conversations about death. I'm sad to say in some ways that Mariah and I never had a conversation about her dying. And that is one of my regrets that we didn't. I understand that we needed that hope, that continual movement, push forward, that we would be okay. We're going to be fine. At the same time, I wish we had that reality of talking about her dying, the possibility, what that meant to both of us, what that meant specifically to her. And I think that would have been so good for us to do. And we didn't do it. So that's a regret of mine that I hope to learn from and in my life to add on to in terms of how I go forward in life. So I want to share that with you, something Ron and I had been talking about.
Yeah. And sometimes we'll have a longer conversation around end of life. Yeah, again, how do we learn to be in the reality of living with this uninvited guest called ALS, and yet, be in the reality of living and dying at the same time, right? Quick story, I remember the first time I met you, Ron and Mariah, I met you guys through Cole. Right. And Julie
Yes.
introduced me to Cole. I came down to Philly to visit you guys, had dinner on my way down. All right. And I smile at this because it's really beautiful. Because I had talked to Cole a lot about lots of different things. And as I understand it, as I was driving down, Cole called me and said, listen, Mom's not in a great space. That day, and if I remember correctly, Cole said that Mom had gone to an ALS clinic. First time she'd been to an ALS clinic in years. in years. And I went, whoa. He said, so they kind of pissed her off, right? And, talking about things she wasn't interested in talking about it. I so love the way Mariah navigated all this. And he says, do me a favor, Ron, don't talk about end of life. And I said, well, Cole, I wasn't planning on it, And because Cole and I had talked about all of that sort of stuff along the way. But anyway, I get to the house, we sit down for dinner, and somehow Mariah starts talking about an end of life thought or question. I just kind of giggled at it. Not that we went into great depths, but like Ron and Mariah, I've known other people, you know what, we're just going to leave that over here. And with all the respect in the world for that. And at the same time, what I know is, that is the reality, because I spend lots of time, at people's bedsides, and hopefully long before bedside, just exploring what's possible. In other words, what does it mean to say yes to a procedure? What does it mean to say no? Alrighty. And I've had many families throughout the year, many relationships about exploring, what does all this look like? Ron, what is my death going to look like? Because people are curious. And so what I'm able to do is share with them just from my own experience about this is what's possible. So my invitation to everyone is to explore what's possible along the way. Not just about how do I want to live my life, but actually, how do I want to die? What color balloons do I want at my party? Because it's my death, my party. And I've known some people who've actually done that. But it's also about honoring people that just don't want to go there. Right? And that's where the art of language is really, really important, about exploring what is possible. And sometimes not wait till, I'm in my deathbed to talk about the things that I needed to talk about, or to say thank you or I'm sorry. Every loss we've had in life, every loss, if we look at it as such, is a symbolic death. And so if we can learn to grieve and feel into the loss of a bike, the loss of a job, the loss of a girlfriend, boyfriend, divorce, those are symbolic deaths. If we can learn to dance with those, to inquire into those, well, when the real one comes for us, maybe we'll be better prepared. Anyway, that's all I've got. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And Ron, I know we wanted to open it up for questions. What you can do is go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and then we could call on you with a question.
Anything in chats, James?
Yes, there are some things in chat as well. Janet was wondering about what do you do when you're in a situation with a loved one that you're caring for who is unable to communicate? And how do you find those, how do you connect? How do you find those moments of joy in a situation like that?
Yeah, well, there's different forms of, different extremes in not being able to communicate. So if you're talking about completely incapable with no eye movement, no ability to lift a thumb, no ability to do an eye twitch, because some people are able to do that if ALS takes you to that deep, dark place. But again, if you're unable to do that, that is the dilemma. And that's why it's important to be able to kind of navigate the ability to communicate before we get to that place. It's gut-wrenching. I've been in that place too many times. And all of a sudden, the loved one is having to guess what this person desires. It can be really, really hard. Who is that question from, James?
That question was coming from Janet.
And Janet, feel free to reach out to me so we can talk. I can share with you more, and you can give me an update on what it all looks like. Okay, I'm happy to share with you. Is that okay?
That's great, Ron.
Awesome.
Thank you. Here's just a quote. Emily was able to find a quote from Viktor Frankl from his book that Ron Gladis referred to. And the quote says, "It does not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us."
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. And she thanked you for mentioning the book, Ron. She's going to order it. Mm-hmm. Let's see. We have from Darlene. Many thanks, Ron and Ron. Feeling Mariah's presence.
Mm-hmm.
lessons you all shared through your lived experience can be applied to many, if not most, diagnoses. I would add that what you told us and helped us remember was about living life fully as we are, individually and in relationship with others. And then a very practical question from Marilyn. Do you know if insurance to supply aids can be utilized while being enrolled in a hospice?
My experience, most insurance doesn't cover home care at all, unless you have a long-term care policy or something like that. That said, you could certainly hire privately for sure, working with hospice. Some people are able to do that because being on hospice gives you very limited amount of care. The biggest thing with hospice is getting a nurse once or twice a week, or as time goes by as needed. And hopefully getting a home health aide to come in 2, 3, 4 days a week, depending on the hospice. And there are other services, but yeah, that's what I know.
Here's another question from Emily. Hearing this conversation about the spiritual aspect, the opportunity for growth in being an ALS caregiver was really meaningful to me. Thank you, Ron and Ron. I got a lot from today.
So one thing I'd like to introduce everyone to, it's one of the finest reads that I've ever read. I mean, actually, again, when I met Ron and Mariah as I was leaving, Ron and Mariah gave me Mariah's booklet that she had written in 2012 or 13, I think. It's a little book, easy read. It's called Bitterness is Not an Option. I took it back to the hotel, read it. I went by the next morning to say goodbye, and I said, do you have a few more of these? Or I said, do you have any more of these? They said, sure. What do you want? 6 dozen? I said, how about a couple hundred? Because I wanted to give them away like candy, because it's just so incredibly profound. There's no advice, there's no how-to. It was just extraordinary wisdom from Mariah on how she was navigating this circumstance. I don't know if you can see this, guys. We put it on, with their permission, we put it on a CD because a lot of folks, couldn't pick up a booklet to read. And so I've asked Ron to get me more booklets that I've ordered from him as well. But it's absolutely extraordinary, and that's our dear Mariah. So thank you, Ron. I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's actually, I want to read something. This is on the back. This is Mariah. People often ask me how I do it, listening to people's problems all day long. I tell them that I don't hear problems. I hear people wanting to change, wanting to be better human beings, wanting to create happier families. From every continent and all walks of life, I hear people wanting to love and be loved more effectively. I hear people wanting to remove barriers in their lives and provide a healthier environment for their loved ones. This is a privileged position that I have, sharing so many compelling and heartwarming moments of laughter and tears with people working toward healing. And Mariah was doing this as she was living with ALS. Mariah never lost the ability or actually stopped working, though obviously it was impacted. As I understand it, the latter years, she worked with a handful of people who she'd worked with for years, who could understand her. And I invite you to truly Google her for those of you that don't know Mariah. And you'll see wonderful talks that she gave, Ron by her side, translating every word she said if it was difficult for people to understand her. That's what's possible.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. We have a question from Denise. If you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hello. Actually, it's not a question. I'm joining you today to see Ron Gladis's smiling face because I haven't seen it in a while and I miss him. I'm one of those people who took care of Mariah for 6 years. And I'm one of the evening aides that used to give her a bath and put her to bed. So I used to have a lot of private talk time. I'm hearing an echo of myself now. I'll try and deal with that. So I've heard Mariah speak of what Ron has meant to her life and her healing and her ability to get as far as she did. He was her hero. That was very clear. We spoke about it often. She compared him to Don Quixote, and that having 2 children after being diagnosed, she attributed to his ability to believe that everything was going to be okay. She spoke of that often. And when Ron talks about the sacred denial, I was often the recipient of Ron's sense of humor at the dinner table, because Ron's aunt and I and his wife Mariah used to tell him he missed his calling as a comedian. He was hysterically funny when he would tell a joke. I still remember so many of those jokes. And when Ron was telling the story about walking with Mariah and pretending she was drunk, I remembered that story. So I was laughing before you got to the end of it, Ron. But Ron being fully Ron, and Ron taking care of himself enough to be able to show up with all that he has to offer, I guess I'm trying to express how much that meant to how far Mariah got in life. Mariah and Stephen Hawking were both diagnosed very early in life, in their 30s, and lived to their 70s. In fact, I believe Stephen Hawking died 3 months before Mariah did. I believe he died in March of the same year that Mariah did. And so this is an epic journey in life, and Ron's ability to show up with all that he has to offer is a great part of what got her as far as it did. So I just wanted to honor that and just reinforce that in today's discussion.
Thank you, Denise. I appreciate you. Nice to see your face.
Thank you, Denise. It looks like Brenda has something. Did you have your hand up there, Brenda, or am I seeing a flower in the corner of your screen that looks like a hand? Okay, great. Would anyone else like to ask a quick question? We are just about out of time here, but we have room for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions if someone has something on their mind. Let me just see if there's anything in the chat here.
I want to say, Denise, how powerful it is that you use the word epic journey. My dad was diagnosed in 2008 and died in 2010. And I am doing this work as a part of the CCALS team precisely because the epic journey that he went through and that my mom is still going through in his absence, and what CCALS brought to the table then, and also what it brings even now to this question of living and dying, as I'm able to appreciate the extreme nature of an ALS diagnosis, and to see how deep these heart connections are and how lasting they are, because they are so deep that you would show up 6 years later, or years later, however many years later it's been since she passed, just to acknowledge and to bow to her presence and the power of her story, the work of showing up for each other, and that CCALS almost unflinchingly demands of those of us who walk with those who have ALS and everyone who is bearing the diagnosis themselves and the circle of care around the ones who live with ALS, that even to ask the question, what does it look like to elongate a moment of joy? Or what does it look like to offload the guilt? I know many of the folks that show up to our monthly gatherings feel a burden of great guilt that they're imposing on their loved ones, such a rigorous demand for care. And so it's just, I love, Ron Hoffman, what you also said about it's a collaborative act of loving and caring. And that layer of dignity is rare. And this disease is extreme in what it asks us to bear, both in terms of guilt and trauma and love and loyalty.
Thank you, Brenda. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. If Ron and Ron would like to say a couple of closing remarks briefly, and then we'll close the meeting for today.
Well, maybe I'll let Ron go last. I was really happy to do this, to see all of you, to see the people who showed up for this. I thought it was very informative. I'm always learning some stuff, and in fact, it was Ron who taught me that not everyone with ALS is really a good person. I thought that was an interesting, or a nice person, let's put it that way, or behaves nicely. So I always thought of ALS patients as being wonderful, wonderful people. And they still need to be taken care of no matter what. I get that part. But that part of it means it's even more difficult for a caregiver to get involved in that situation. I was very lucky that Mariah was really good about it. She had her moments, no question. And internally, I had to say at times, I had to take care of myself. I said, no, I can't do that right now. I just couldn't. And she got that because we had those discussions. So in that way, I was really very, very lucky. But thank you all, and thank Ron Hoffman for setting this up, and for you, James, for pulling this all together. I'm available to anyone here who wants to contact me. You could do that through Ron Hoffman or James or whoever, to have a further dialogue if I can help at all. So I'm open to that. And thank you. I really appreciate all of you today. Come on a beautiful Sunday afternoon to this conference we're having here. So stay well, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. One last thought. You know, as it is in life, as it is in living with ALS, you know, we make choices. We have decisions. And regardless of the decision that we make, whether you say yes to this or no to this, but every choice and decision we make, there's consequences and ramification for those decisions. What does it mean if I say yes? And what does it mean if I say no? So from my perspective, it's incredibly important that we inquire into the questions, even the questions that we're not sure about, in order to consciously make choices that would best serve us as, not just as an individual, but as a family, as a couple. Incredibly important for self-inquiry into all of this. And, you know, hopefully today there's just a couple nuggets that you can take away. And I just have a huge appreciation for all of you that showed up. And again, for those of you who know us and for those of you who don't, feel free to reach out anytime with questions, thoughts, or concerns. Brenda, Eileen, Michael, of course, James, and Ron. I'm not sure if any of our other staff who's on. Thank you for showing up. I see a lot of my friends out there, Stephen and Steve and Suzanne and others. Jude, thanks for being here. And for those I don't know, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll see you down the road. Okay.
Love you, Ron.
Thanks, Ron.
You too, Ron. Take care, everyone.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.